night air grows bitterly cold as April fades into May. A heavy mist creeps across the iron rails of the northern states. There is no wind, but the trees tremble. Somewhere in the dark distance, a low, mournful whistle cuts through the silence. It is a sound that belongs to the dead. Locals who live near the old tracks know better than to look outside when the midnight frost settles. They lock their doors and draw their heavy curtains. They hear the steady chug of a steam engine approaching. But no timetables list a midnight arrival. This train does not run on coal or water. It runs on a nationwide sorrow that has never truly healed. Men stand paralyzed in their fields as the iron behemoth glides past without making a single sound against the tracks. The air pressure drops and clocks stop ticking. The phantom train of Abraham Lincoln is making its eternal journey home. In the spring of 1865, a great tragedy struck Washington City. The 16th President of the United States was struck down by an assassin's bullet. The nation was plunged into a deep, agonizing grief. Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton organized a grand procession to return the fallen leader to Springfield. A special locomotive was commissioned for this grim task. It was draped entirely in black velvet and dark bunting. The engine bore a portrait of Abraham Lincoln mounted on the front above the cowcatcher. Behind the engine trailed 9 cars holding mourners, and the heavy lead-lined coffin of the slain president. The funeral train traveled through Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Indiana, and finally Illinois. Millions of weeping citizens lined the tracks at all hours of the day and night. They lit bonfires and held torches to illuminate the passing cars. Their collective grief saturated the very iron and wood of the railway. This outpouring of sorrow created an emotional scar across the landscape. The physical train completed its morbid journey and was eventually lost to history. The engine was sold and destroyed in a terrible prairie fire years later. But the memory of that slow rolling iron coffin refused to leave the mortal realm. The first strange sightings began exactly 1 year after the assassination. Watchmen along the Hudson River line in New York reported a sudden, unnatural drop in temperature. Their oil lanterns flickered and died without a breeze. A thick black cloud descended upon the tracks, smelling of sulfur and wilted funeral roses. Out of this unnatural fog emerged a pilot train. It was a phantom locomotive coated in rust and shadow. Its headlight cast a sickly pale beam that provided no actual illumination. The skeleton crew, operating the machine, wore the uniforms of the Union Army. They stared straight ahead with hollow, rotting eyes. The pilot train makes no sound as it passes. The heavy wheels turn, but the metal does not grind against the rails. Observers claim that any music playing nearby suddenly warps into a slow, mournful dirge. Dogs begin to howl in terror, and farm animals stampede in wild panic toward the hills. Moments after the pilot train fades into the mist, the main procession arrives. This is the true funeral train of Abraham Lincoln. The massive steam engine is shrouded in ethereal black cloth that billows without wind. The portrait of the president on the front seems to watch the living with sorrowful eyes. The smokestack belches thick black clouds that blot out the moon and stars. The train cars trail behind, glowing with a faint blue luminescence. The windows are lined with spectral figures dressed in mourning attire from the 1860s. They hold ghostly handkerchiefs to their weeping faces in a display of endless grief. The flat car directly behind the engine carries an eerie military band. The musicians are skeletons clad in decaying blue coats, holding tarnished brass instruments. They play a silent hymn that resonates only within the minds of those who watch. It is a tune so sorrowful that witnesses often fall to their knees weeping. As the train rolls onward, the environment itself reacts to the supernatural presence. The spring blooms along the tracks instantly wither and turn to gray ash. The morning dew freezes into solid ice. Even the mighty rivers running parallel to the tracks seem to slow their current as a gesture of deep respect. One night, a switchman in Ohio named Thomas stood duty near a lonely junction. He had heard the local legends, but dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. Just past midnight, his telegraph machine began to click wildly. The message was garbled and made no sense, but it filled him with a sudden, profound dread. Thomas stepped out of his wooden shack to inspect the tracks. The air turned so cold that his breath plumed like white smoke. A strange, static electricity made the hair on his arms stand up. The crickets and frogs abruptly stopped their nightly chorus, leaving an oppressive, heavy silence over the dark valley. Down the tracks, a pale light broke through the tree line. Thomas raised his lantern, expecting a late freight delivery. Instead, he saw the phantom pilot train gliding over the iron rails. He stood frozen as the silent, ghostly soldiers stared down at him from the spectral engine car with their empty eye sockets. Before Thomas could move, the second train emerged from the fog. The phantom funeral train of Abraham Lincoln bore down upon the junction. The black bunting whipped wildly in a non-existent gale. The glowing blue windows revealed the weeping mourners trapped in their eternal loop of misery and mourning for the fallen president. Thomas stared into the second to last car. It was the presidential car, entirely bathed in a cold blue light. Inside, resting on a raised catafalque, was the coffin of Abraham Lincoln. Standing around the coffin were ghostly honor guards holding their rifles at parade rest. Their faces were pale and completely lifeless. Suddenly, a tall, dark figure materialized on the rear platform of the moving train. It was the spirit of Abraham Lincoln himself. The phantom president wore his iconic stovepipe hat and black frock coat. His gaunt face was twisted in a mask of eternal sorrow, and he looked directly at the terrified switchman. The president slowly raised a long, bony finger and pointed toward the eastern horizon. Thomas felt a wave of despair wash over him, so powerful that his heart physically ached. He collapsed onto the cold gravel beside the tracks, clutching his chest. The spectral train continued its silent march toward the western plains. The air remained freezing long after the caboose vanished into the night. Thomas dragged himself back into his shack, shivering violently. His lantern flame refused to reignite, and the telegraph machine remained completely dead. He sat in the freezing darkness until the morning sun finally broke over the distant tree line, bringing warmth. A similar event occurred near the town of Albany, New York. A night watchman named William was patrolling the rail yards during a fierce rainstorm. The heavy downpour suddenly stopped in mid-air, suspended, as if time itself had frozen. The dark clouds parted to reveal a blood-red moon hanging ominously above. The phantom pilot train drifted past William, casting no shadows. The wheels glided an inch above the soaked rails. William tried to shout, but his voice caught in his throat. He watched as the skeletal band played their silent dirge. The sheer weight of the supernatural presence forced him to his trembling knees. The main funeral train followed closely behind its black velvet drapes, dripping with phantom rain. The faces of the spectral mourners pressed against the glass, contorted in soundless agony. William felt the memories of a grieving nation flood his own mind. He experienced the exact pain of those who stood there decades ago. As the presidential car passed, William saw the tall, shadowy figure standing near the coffin. The spirit of Abraham Lincoln turned its head slowly. The hollow eyes locked onto William, transferring a heavy burden of national sorrow. William closed his eyes and wept uncontrollably, unable to break the horrific supernatural connection to the ghost. When William finally opened his eyes, the train was gone. The rain resumed its heavy assault on the muddy ground. The watchman was found the next morning, wandering aimlessly through the rail yard. His dark hair had turned completely white overnight, and he never spoke a single word to anyone ever again. Further down the line in Indiana, a group of teenagers sought out the ghost train. Armed with flashlights and reckless courage, they camped near an abandoned stretch of track. They built a fire and waited for the stroke of midnight. As the clock struck 12, their blazing campfire was instantly snuffed out. A suffocating frost descended upon the campsite. The ground hardened, and the surrounding trees became coated in thick ice. The distant wail of a steam whistle echoed through the woods. It sounded like a choir of weeping souls crying out for salvation. The teenagers huddled together, paralyzed by an overwhelming primal fear. The spectral pilot engine burst through the dark woods, its pale headlight sweeping over the terrified youths. The dead soldiers on board turned their rotting faces toward the camp. One of the teenagers tried to run, but his legs refused to obey his commands. He could only watch as the nightmare unfolded before him. The massive funeral engine followed, dragging its blue glowing cars. The air smelled of ozone and decayed lilies. The phantom band played their silent, crushing symphony of despair. The teenagers squeezed their eyes shut, but the ghastly images burned directly into their minds. They could hear the endless weeping of the phantom mourners. The final car approached, carrying the remains of Abraham Lincoln. The ghost of the slain president stood on the back deck, staring down at the huddled group. The sorrow radiating from the apparition was completely unbearable. The sheer emotional weight felt like a physical pressure, crushing the breath out of the young witnesses. The train faded away, leaving the teenagers shivering in the dark. When morning arrived, they fled the woods and returned to their homes. They all suffered from severe night terrors for the rest of their lives. None of them ever went near a railroad track again, terrified of what might be waiting there. The sightings are not limited to the rural countryside. In the heart of Pennsylvania, urban legends speak of the phantom train crossing over modern bridges. Commuters driving late at night report their car engines dying without warning. They sit stranded on the road as a thick, unnatural fog rolls in from the nearby tracks. A truck driver named Richard was hauling freight near Philadelphia. His headlights cut through the gloom when his vehicle suddenly lost all power. He coasted to a halt right before a railroad crossing. The red warning lights began to flash, but there was no sound of a modern diesel horn in the night. Richard watched in sheer disbelief as the phantom funeral train crossed the highway. The rusted pilot engine led the way, followed by the towering, black-shrouded locomotive. The ghostly blue cars cast an eerie glow over his truck cabin. The skeletal musicians played their silent song, while the spectral mourners wept in the windows. The ghost of Abraham Lincoln stood tall and grim on the final platform. Richard swore. The president looked right through the windshield of the truck. The hollow eyes of the phantom seemed to judge the soul of the terrified driver. The train vanished into the dark woods, leaving the crossing completely empty and silent. Richard's truck instantly roared back to life. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal and sped away from the crossing. He arrived at his destination pale and shaking uncontrollably. When he recounted the story to his fellow drivers, many nodded in silent understanding. The phantom train was a well-known local secret. Some researchers claim the train is bound to a cosmic clock. It only appears in late April and early May, mirroring the original funeral timeline. Ghost hunters flock to the old route hoping to catch a glimpse of the spectral procession. Most return empty-handed, but a few capture terrifying anomalies on their cameras. Photographs taken near the haunted tracks often show strange blue streaks of light. Audio recordings pick up the faint sound of weeping and a slow rhythmic thumping like a train rolling over old iron tracks. Even the digital equipment seems to malfunction in the presence of the lingering residual sorrow of the tragedy. One paranormal investigator set up a camp near the Springfield terminus. He wanted to document the final arrival of the ghost train. He surrounded his position with sensitive microphones and thermal cameras. Just after 2 a.m, the temperature plummeted, and his equipment began to register a massive, sudden surge of cold energy. The investigator looked down the tracks and saw the pale headlight. The pilot train arrived right on schedule, carrying its silent skeletal crew. The massive black funeral engine followed belching phantom smoke into the night sky. The investigator aimed his camera, but the viewfinder instantly frosted over, completely obscuring his vision of the ghosts. He lowered the camera and looked with his own eyes. The blue glowing cars passed by, revealing the eternal mourners trapped inside. The investigator felt the overwhelming wave of grief hit him. He dropped to his knees, weeping for a man who died more than a century ago. The sorrow was absolute and consuming. The spirit of Abraham Lincoln stood on the final car, watching the weeping man. The phantom president offered no comfort and no malice. He merely existed in his endless loop of tragedy and national heartbreak. The train faded into the mist, leaving the investigator alone on the cold ground, forever changed by the encounter. Those who witness the phantom train carry a heavy burden. The sorrow of that dreadful April never truly washes away. Witnesses report feeling a lingering sadness that shadows their daily lives. They find themselves crying for no reason, mourning a loss that belongs to an entirely different generation of hurting people. The physical tracks have been replaced many times over the decades. Modern steel rails and concrete ties have taken the place of the old iron and wood. But the phantom train does not travel on physical tracks. It travels on the psychic imprint left behind by millions of grieving citizens lining the route. The landscape remembers the pain of a fractured nation. The tears that soaked into the earth created a permanent, supernatural highway. As long as the memory of Abraham Lincoln endures, the train will continue to run. It is a haunting reminder that some wounds are simply too deep to ever fully heal over time. Historians write about the facts of the assassination and the subsequent funeral. They document the route, the crowds, and the final burial in Springfield. But they cannot document the cold dread that descends upon the rural tracks at midnight. They cannot explain the sudden dying of the spring blooms when the phantom engine passes. The ghost of Abraham Lincoln remains trapped between worlds. He is unable to find rest due to the massive anchor of national grief pulling him back. The silent skeletal band must play their mournful tune for all eternity. The weeping phantoms in the glowing blue cars must relive their terrible agony year after year. Locals still lock their doors during the final weeks of April. They ignore the sudden drop in temperature and the flickering of their lights. They refuse to look out the window when the soundless, heavy train rumbles past their homes. To look upon the phantom procession is to invite eternal sadness into your soul. The next time you find yourself near old train tracks on a cold spring night, listen closely to the silence. If the crickets stop chirping and the air suddenly turns freezing, walk away immediately. Do not wait for the pale beam of the ghostly headlight to cut through the dark, gathering mist. The phantom train of Abraham Lincoln is always searching for new passengers to join its endless mourning. If the tall, shadowy figure on the final platform looks into your eyes, you will never be the same. You will become a part of the grand funeral procession, forever trapped in a journey that never ends.